What I'd like to do, I'd like to break my talk into two parts. I'd like to first of all talk about the causes of the present crisis, and I'd like to speculate on where this is all headed. Now, with regard to the causes, it's very important to understand that who caused this situation is of tremendous importance because it involves assigning blame. You really have two choices here. You can argue that the West, and especially the United States, caused the crisis, or you can argue that the Russians caused the crisis. But that means that whoever you argue caused the crisis is responsible for this disaster. And it is important to understand that this is a disaster. Ukraine has lost Crimea. It's, in my opinion, going to lose the Donbass. And the only interesting question to me at this point is whether it's also going to lose more territory in the eastern part of its country. Furthermore, Ukraine's economy is wrecked. Its cities are in the process of being wrecked. The international economy is going to be badly affected by these events as they go on. This is going to have terrible consequences, I think, for the Democrats in the fall. Furthermore, it makes it difficult for the United States to pivot out of Europe and pivot to China, where there is a potential threat, which is China. Furthermore, we're driving the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, which makes no sense at all. And all at the same time, we're making Eastern Europe a very unstable region, and therefore forcing us to, if anything, up the ante there. So this is a disastrous situation. So the question of who caused it and who bears the blame really matters. Now, the conventional wisdom in the United States and in the West more generally is that the Russians are responsible for this. And in particular, Vladimir Putin is responsible. As I'm sure almost all of you know, I don't buy this argument at all, and I haven't bought it for a long time. In my opinion, the West bears primary responsibility for what is happening today. And it was largely a result of a decision in April 2006 to make Ukraine and to make Georgia a part of NATO. We were going to integrate Ukraine into NATO come hell or high water. Now, the Russians said at the time that this is categorically unacceptable. The Russians made it clear that they had swallowed the first two tranches of NATO expansion, the 99 expansion and the 2004 expansion. But Georgia and Ukraine were not going to become part of NATO. They were drawing a line in the sand. They said this is an existential threat to us. And indeed, in August of that year, of course, August 2008, you had a war involving the Russians and the Georgians over the whole issue of whether or not Georgia would become part of NATO. Now, it's important to understand that when we talk about Western policy and we focus on NATO and expansion of NATO into Ukraine, that actually Western policy had three prongs to it. The core prong was definitely integrating Ukraine into NATO, but the other two prongs were integrating Ukraine into the European Union and turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy, in effect, putting in place the Orange Revolution. And these three prongs of the strategy were all designed to make Ukraine a pro-Western country, a country in the West's orbit sitting on Russia's border. And again, the Russians made it unequivocally clear at the time that this was not going to happen. Now, the first crisis broke out in February 2014. The way I like to think about this is that you had a major crisis in February 2014, broke out that date. Then you had a major crisis breaking out in December of last year, that's December 2021, and on February 24th of this year, the war started. Now, what about this crisis in February of 2014, February 22nd to be exact. It was precipitated in large part by a coup that was supported by the United States that took place in Ukraine and resulted in a pro-Russian leader, President Yanukovych, being overthrown and being replaced by a pro-American prime minister. The Russians found this intolerable. At the same time, they were debating with the West and with the Ukrainians over EU expansion. And always in the background at that point in time was NATO expansion. This blew up, and it had two consequences. One is that the Russians, in effect, took Crimea away from Ukraine for themselves. They had no intention of ever letting Sevastopol become a NATO neighborhood. And the second thing that happened is that the Russians helped foster a civil war in eastern Ukraine. And of course, that civil war festered well after 2014. But the crisis really blew up in 2014. Then, starting about mid-year, and really heating up at the end of last year, I would say in December 2021, was a second major crisis. And the question is, what caused this crisis? And in my opinion, it was caused largely by the fact that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. It's commonplace in the West, especially in Washington these days, to say that Ukraine had nothing to fear regarding, the United States had nothing to fear. Russia had nothing to fear regarding Ukraine becoming part of NATO. And Russia had nothing to fear because NATO was doing nothing to move forward Ukraine's incorporation into NATO. I think in a de jure sense, that's absolutely correct. But in a de facto way, that's wrong. What we were doing was we were arming the Ukrainians. And you want to remember, it's President Trump in December of 2017, who was under great pressure, who decided to arm the Ukrainians. So we were arming the Ukrainians, we were training the Ukrainians, and we were forming ever closer diplomatic ties with the Ukrainians. And this spooked the Russians. It especially spooked the Russians in the summer of last year, when the Ukrainian military used drones against Russian forces in the Donbass region. It especially spooked the Russians last summer when the British drove a destroyer through territorial waters, Russian territorial waters in the Black Sea. It especially spooked the Russians in November when we were flying bombers within 13 miles of the Russian coast. So all these events, coupled with this de facto bringing of Ukraine into NATO, pushed the Russians to what Sergei Lavrov said was the boiling point. You know, Lavrov was asked in January why the Russians had reached this point and why we were in the midst of a crisis. And he said, Lavrov said in January, we had reached our boiling point. First expansion of NATO, second expansion of NATO, and then all of these events associated with Ukraine. The Russians had had it. So you had a crisis of massive proportions, which of course resulted on February 24th in the Russians invading Ukraine. And we are now in the midst of a real war. This is not just a civil war in eastern Ukraine, which is what we had before February 24th. We now have a real war. So this brings us to the question of what is the conventional wisdom on this subject, and how do I think about the opposing argument? The opposing argument is that this has nothing to do with NATO expansion. It's really quite remarkable. When you listen to people in the administration speak, and when you read editorials in the Washington Post, words like this are spoken. This has absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansion. I don't know how anybody can say that. The Russians have been saying since April 2008, that this is all about NATO expansion, that NATO expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat to them. But Americans simply refuse to believe that. Not all Americans, but many Americans, and certainly the policy elite in this country. And instead, what they have done is they've created a story that it is not American policy. It's not NATO expansion that's driving this train. Instead, it's Vladimir Putin. And it's the fact that Vladimir Putin is either bent on recreating the Soviet Union or he's interested in creating a greater Russia. But whichever one of those two outcomes you take, he is ultimately an expansionist. He's on the march. And thank God we expanded NATO, because if we hadn't expanded NATO, he'd probably be in Berlin by now, if not Paris. This is the basic argument. He is an aggressor. There are a number of problems with that argument. First of all, before February 22nd, 2014, nobody was arguing that he was aggressor. Nobody was arguing that NATO expansion was required for the purposes of containing Russia before February 22nd, 2014. We didn't think he was a problem. And in fact, when the crisis broke out on February 22nd, 2014, we were actually shocked. If you go back and look at the newspapers at the time, the Obama administration was caught with its pants down. Why? Because they didn't think that that the Russians were aggressive. But of course, we had to invent the story after the crisis broke out so that we weren't blamed for what happened. We had to blame the Russians. So we created this story. Second reason you want to doubt this is that Putin has never said that he is bent on recreating the Soviet Union, or he's bent on creating a greater Russia. He's never said he was bent on conquering Ukraine and integrating it into Russia. There's no question that in his heart, he thinks that it would be appropriate for Ukraine to be part of Russia. In his heart, he's made it clear he'd love to bring back the Soviet Union. But he's also explicitly said that in his head, he fully understands that this is a bad idea. So if you look at what he said, there's no reason to think he's bent on recreating the Soviet Union or creating a greater Russia. To take this a step further, he doesn't have the capability. He doesn't have the capability for two reasons. First of all, he doesn't have a big enough military. This is a country whose gross national product is smaller than Texas's, right? This is not the former Soviet Union in its heyday. Furthermore, the Russians understand that occupying countries or occupying territory in Eastern Europe is a prescription for big trouble. Most of us on this call are old enough to remember the Cold War and all the trouble that the Soviets had. Think East Germany, 1953, Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, constant trouble with the Poles. And one could argue that the Romanians and the Albanians were the biggest pain in the necks they ever faced. The Russians are surely sophisticated enough to know that not only do they not have the capability, but that occupying Ukraine, occupying the Baltic states would be like swallowing a porcupine. This would be crazy. So I think there's hardly any evidence to support that. And the final point I'd make is if you look at what the Russians are doing militarily in Ukraine at the moment, it does not look like they're bent on conquering the country and occupying it and integrating it into a greater Russia. But anyway, here we are. And I think everybody is very interested in the question of where we go from here. So let me say a few words about that. First of all, let me start with US policy. US policy is to double down. That's what we're going to do. This is what we did after 2014. Instead of reevaluating and saying maybe NATO expansion is not such a good idea, we went in the opposite direction. This is why I'm telling you that by 2021, the Russians understood that we were turning Ukraine into a de facto member of NATO. They understood that. So what we did after 2014 is double down, and what we're going to do now and what we're doing now is doubling down. And what does that mean? We're encouraging the Ukrainians to resist. We're not going to fight for them, you understand? We're going to fight to the last Ukrainian, but we're not going to do any of the fighting. They're on their own in that regard. But we're going to arm them and do what we can to train them at this late date and hope that they can hang in there and duke it out with the Russians. And nobody believes they're going to defeat the Russians, but maybe you'll get a stalemate. Now, the question you have to ask yourself, this is really the key question, is what are the Russians going to do, right? It seems to me that a lot of people in the West think that if the Ukrainians provide enough resistance, the Russians will roll over and play dead. Or maybe Vladimir Putin will throw his hands up, he'll surrender, he'll say, this was all a bad idea, I regret doing it. Or maybe there'll be a coup in Moscow, he'll be overthrown, and they'll bring in leaders who will work out a deal with us, and Ukraine will live happily ever after, we will live happily ever after, and the Russians will be chastened. I've spent my entire adult life studying great power politics. I know a lot about great power politics. This is not the way the world works, and it is certainly not the way the Russians work. You want to understand, going back to what I said about the April 2008 decision, the Russians said at the time, this is an existential threat. This is an existential threat, right? So even before the current war, Ukraine becoming part of NATO was viewed as an existential threat. Now you're talking about a situation where you defeat the Russians in Ukraine. This is a much worse outcome for the Russians than what happened in April 2008, and a much worse outcome than what happened in February 2014. And the Russians are not going to roll over and play dead. In fact, what the Russians are going to do is they're going to crush the Ukrainians. They're going to bring out the big guns. They're going to turn places like Kiev and other cities in Ukraine into rubble. They're going to do Fallujahs. They're going to do Mosuls. They're going to do Grozny's. You know what happened in World War II when the United States was faced with the possibility of having to invade the Japanese home islands in early 1945. The idea of invading the Japanese home islands after what happened at Iwo Jima and then later what happened in Okinawa really spooked us. So you know what we did? We decided to burn Japanese cities to the ground starting on March 10th, 1945. We killed more people the first night we firebombed Tokyo than we killed at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And we were systematically burning Japanese cities to the ground. Why? Because we did not want to invade the Japanese main islands. When a great power feels threatened, the Russians are going to pull out all stops in Ukraine to make sure that they win. And then there's the nuclear dimension to this. The Russians have already put their nuclear weapons on high alert. This is a really significant development because what they were doing was sending us a very powerful signal as to how seriously they take this crisis and what's going on. So again, if we start winning and the Russians start losing, you want to understand that what we're talking about doing here is backing a nuclear-armed great power that sees what's happening as an existential threat into a corner. This is really dangerous. Go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't think that what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis was as threatening to us as this situation is to the Russians. But if you go back and look at how American decision makers thought at the time, they were scared stiff. They thought that Soviet missiles in Cuba was an existential threat. And they were willing, many of Kennedy's advisors, to use our nuclear arsenal against the Soviet Union. That's how serious great powers get when they think they face existential threats. So in my opinion, we are in a very dangerous situation. I think the likelihood of nuclear war is very small, but the likelihood doesn't have to be high for me to be really scared because of the consequences associated with nuclear use. So we better be extremely careful here regarding what we do in terms of pushing the Russians into the corner. But again, I'm not sure that's going to happen, because I think what's going to happen here is that in a competition between us and the Russians will win. Now you're saying to yourself, why is he saying that? I think that if you think about this, you want to think about who has the greater resolve, right? Who really cares more about this situation, the Russians or the Americans? The Americans do not care that much about Ukraine. The Americans have made it clear they are not even willing to fight and die for Ukraine. So it's not that important to us. For the Russians, they have made it clear it's an existential threat. So the balance of resolve, I believe, favors them. So as we walk up the escalation ladder moving forward, my guess, and it's just my guess, is that the Russians will prevail, not the Americans, and the Russians will prevail because the balance of resolve favors them. Now, the question is, who loses this war? I think it doesn't matter much to the United States if we lose in the sense that the Russians prevail in Ukraine. I think the real losers in this war are the Ukrainians. And I think what's happened here is we have led the Ukrainians down the primrose path. We have pushed very hard to encourage the Ukrainians to want to become part of NATO. We have pushed very hard to make them part of NATO. We have pushed very hard to make them a Western bulwark on Russia's borders, despite the fact the Russians made it clear that this was unacceptable to them. We, in effect, and here I'm talking about the West, we took a stick and we poked the bear in the eye. And as you all know, if you take a stick and you poke a bear in the eye, that bear is probably not going to smile and laugh at what you're doing. That bear is probably going to fight back. And that's exactly what's happening here. And that bear is going to tear apart Ukraine. That bear is in the process of tearing apart Ukraine. And again, we go back to where we started. Who bears responsibility for this? Do the Russians bear responsibility for this? I don't think so. There's no question the Russians are doing the dirty work. I don't want to make light of that fact. But the question is, what caused the Russians to do this? And in my opinion, the answer is very simple: the United States of America. There's no question that the Ukrainians have agency. I don't dispute that. And my view all along is that if the Ukrainians were smart, what they would do is divorce themselves from the United States, right? They've hitched their wagon to the United States. And your description of how the Ukrainians are behaving today is absolutely correct. And we're encouraging that, right? And as I said in my presentation, the question is, what are the consequences of that? You're quite confident that the Russians will lose in Ukraine the way they lost in Afghanistan. I would not bet a lot of money on that, but I would note that even if the Russians lose, in the process, they will destroy Ukraine. And from Ukraine's point of view, that's not a good thing. This is why my view is that Ukraine should have long ago divorced itself from the United States and worked out a modus vivendi with Russia. My view is, if you're a reasonably small power in the international system and you live next door to a gorilla, you have to go to great lengths to accommodate that gorilla. And the last thing you want to do is poke that gorilla in the eye, because the gorilla will do great damage to you and it probably will never forget. I don't know if you're old enough to remember when Fidel Castro came to power in 1959, but shortly thereafter, we put sanctions on Fidel Castro and on Cuba. And those sanctions are basically still on Cuba. We've never gotten over the fact that Cuba behaved in ways that we considered to be unacceptable. And I think you have a similar situation here. And my view is, yes, the Ukrainians have agency, but if they were smart, they'd divorce themselves from the United States and try to work out a modus vivendi with Russia.
John, I thank you for setting the stage so well and giving us the context Um, I particularly like the label that has been given to you as an offensive realist. Well, that sure comes through clear tonight, doesn't it? The U.S. is to blame? How offensive is that? I'm going to give a thumbnail description of how I come at this. John and I both grew up in the streets of New York, John in Brooklyn and I in the Bronx. Actually, my wife's from Brooklyn. She married up, as we used to say in those days. In any case, I remember being at the hands of bigger gangs and bigger guys. And I used to shake my fist when I got home and say, when I get big, I'm never going to let anybody do that to me, okay? Well, here's the analogy. Putin just got big. He got big last year. He got big when the Chinese threw their lot in with him and said, yeah, we're in the same fix you are. Let's join hands, let's join forces and do the kind of alliance that exceeds the traditional alliance. That's kind of my bottom line here. But let me get a little bit involved in Ukraine first. How many, if I can see a show of hands, how many have seen the video of Victoria Nuland and our ambassador in Kiev, Jeffrey Pyatt, talking about how they were going to arrange this coup in Kiev? Well, okay, not too many. So let me see if we can bring that one up now. Is that the video queued up, the one with Nuland talking to Pyatt?
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously.
I'm not hearing any sound. Is anyone else?
Especially the announcement of
No.
Deputy
Okay.
Minister, and you've seen some of my notes on the
Okay.
troubles in the marriage. Right?
Let's ditch that then, and we'll go on. The point is that this coup was the most blatant coup in history. It was advertised 18 days beforehand on YouTube when a conversation, an intercepted conversation between Assistant Secretary of State Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt was put on YouTube on the 4th of February, 2014. Now, McGovern, being used to a little bit used to coups and what happens if they're divulged ahead of time, breathed a sigh of relief and said, oh, poor Yatsenyuk, he's never going to be prime minister now that the coup's blown. Well, apparently, Vladimir Putin had the same reaction because he stayed in Sochi for the Winter Olympics, never decided to come home. And lo and behold, on the 22nd of February, there's the coup. Now, we know enough about the coup now to know that it was arranged with thanks to the Western intelligence services, if you could put it that way. And we know the result. Now, for just a little bit of background, why did Victoria Nuland, whose claim to fame is working for Dick Cheney, and who is an arch neocon person, why did she decide it was so important to get the Russians, to get them over the barrel in Ukraine? Well, it goes back to the year before. The year before, when, if we could have the second slide, when I say slide, the year before when President Obama, to his credit, was reluctant to start another war in the Middle East. They wanted him to bomb Syria. He didn't want to bomb Syria. He even said, I'll go to Congress. Oh, that's a big deal, okay? Now, here was a New York Times op-ed after Putin pulled Obama's chestnuts out of the fire. I hope that you can see it. It appeared on September 11th, 2014. In the midst of all this appeared in the New York Times, and it said that my working and personal relationship with Obama is marked by growing trust, the coin of the realm. Then he objected to something. Then he said, his speech, that Obama's speech last week, really bothered me. I don't agree with it at all. This business about the exceptional country being able to do exceptional things. No. The way I look at it, there are big countries and small countries, rich and poor, one with long traditions of democracy, others different. Their policies different. Well, we're all different. But when the Lord's blessings look on us, we must not forget that God created us all equal. Now, I was told at the time by a pretty good source that Putin penned that last paragraph of that op-ed himself. And confirmation of a kind came about 2 years ago when he gave an interview, and sort of off the top of his head, he said precisely the same thing in almost exactly the same words. So what does that mean? Growing trust? What does that do to the Mickey Mouse? What does that do to the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex, which grew like topsy after Eisenhower's warning that unbridled influence of this MIC, the military-industrial complex, would be a danger to our democracy. A little footnote there. Eisenhower said the only antidote to that is a fully informed American citizenry. And we have that far from that now. What's my point here? This was the high water of our relationship, September 2013. It took the neocons not even a year, about a half a year, to stage the coup on the Maidan in Kiev. The causal relationship was not something that McGovern dreamed up. Bob Perry and I went through this in detail, and it seemed, and actually I had a catbird seat at the top of the CNN building when Joe Lieberman and Paul Wolfowitz were talking about this as though, well, it looked like a funeral there. They had missed their chance. They didn't get their war against Syria. And so a lot of this was reaction to that. They had a lot of time to prepare, and they invested $5 billion with a B, dollars into Ukraine's aspirations to join the West, okay? So here we had a decent chance for growing trust, okay? Doveraj, no proveraj. Trust, but verify. This was all shunted aside by the coup, arranged primarily by Nuland and Pyatt and the other people who were doing the dirty work, and acquiesced in by our French and our German allies. They were there. They saw what happened. Steinmeier, the German foreign minister, I met with his principal deputy, and I started talking about the coup in Kiev, and he said, get this. He said, what coup? He was there. Steinmeier and the French took it upon themselves to guarantee the Minsk process, and they didn't have the chance. They didn't have the guts to follow through because the US didn't want it. So maybe I'm an offensive realist, but that's how I look at it. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, now, just at about this time, you'll be surprised, perhaps. No, it's the one before that. Yeah. Now, the Defense Intelligence Agency is obliged by act of Congress to make sure they do an annual strategy report. And this is what they came up with at the end of 2015. So they had a year plus since the coup. Now, that's what they said. That's what the Kremlin is convinced the US is trying to do. John Mearsheimer is very nice in calling that democracy promotion. but he explains that in the next phrase by saying it's a coup. So this is what the Defense Intelligence Agency said. Who knows that they issued this? Did McGovern get this from Jonathan Pollard or one of his old successors. No. You have to read everything that comes out in the media. This slipped out. May we have the next slide, please? Okay, what I'd like to do is get a little granular here and talk about how we proceeded once Biden got his feet, so to speak, feet on the ground. I call this U.S. diplomacy. You can think of it what you will. March 17th, Putin's a killer. March 18th, 19th, Blinken and Sullivan insult the Chinese, talking down to them and making very much like the old imperialists that the Chinese are so used to. Now, interestingly, on March 24th, this is all last year, the Ukrainian President Zelensky, out of the blue, announced, we're taking back Crimea. We're taking back Crimea, and if we have to use military means, well, so be it. That's what we'll do. And, I don't think there's anybody, not even on CNN, who would say that Zelensky thought up this idea all by himself and didn't check with the United States. Of course, he got permission. So put yourself in Putin's place. It's pretty much a declaration of war and was described as such by Western media as well. Aha, what's Putin going to do now? It's Ukrainian official policy. It's an order that we're going to take back Crimea. This is important, okay? Because it's all in this calculation that Putin is looking at these new leaders, if you will, and seeing what they're doing, how they're acting, killer, talking down the Chinese. Now we're going to take back Crimea. Now, on March 25th, no coincidence, 24th, 25th, Russian troops start going around the area of Ukraine. Now, they built up a lot of troops. And of course, we reported that, and the New York Times, Washington Post reported that ad nauseum. But finally, Biden got wind of it, or at least started to appreciate the significance of it. And he calls Putin on April 13th. Now, what else happened on April 13th? Well, everybody was saying, oh, there are tons of troops there. There are a lot of troops. And Shoigu, the defense minister, gets up and says, yeah, you got that right. Would you believe 2 armies and 3 airborne units? Would you believe that? That's what we mean by disequilibrium. This is what we mean by asymmetrical power. You got it? Biden, on that same day, reverses the Navy's orders, sending 2 heavily armed and very sophisticated ships into the Black Sea. They were about to enter the Dardanelles, and he turned them around and said, go visit Greece. And then finally, on that same day, Biden suggests, hey, Vladimir, let's have a summit. We'd like to get together and talk this stuff through because we don't like this, okay? Next slide, please. So the summit takes place on the 16th of June, okay? And Biden says to Putin, and we know this from Biden's own voice, okay? What Biden is saying is they couldn't get him onto the plane long enough to have him say these strange things, okay? Biden to Putin, we know you got a rough road to hoe here. We know you're being squeezed by the Chinese. We know their multi-thousand-mile border. Chinese is not only going to be a major economic power, it's going to be a major military. We know about that. You know, I would love to have been a fly on the wall when Putin connected with his advisors and said, who's advising this president? Who's telling him that the situation is the same between China and Russia as it was 4 decades ago? I mean, hello? And so they decided, Putin and Xi finally, we got to educate this guy. We got to tell them that nobody's squeezing anyone else except in a fraternal embrace. And that's what they set out to do for the next several months. On December 15th, 2021, there was a summit, a virtual summit between Putin and Xi, President Xi Jinping of China. Now, it was heavily choreographed, and they gave the first minute to the New York Times and other media because it was so clearly designed to show, look, we are very close allies. As a matter of fact, they made the claim that our relationship, our strategic relationship, exceeds an alliance in its closeness and in its effectiveness. Now, most people say, well, that's really, really neat rhetoric. Chinese don't usually do that rhetoric, but it's, it helps Putin. Well, that's what it was designed to do, okay? Now, on December 15th, when they said this, on that very same day, the Russians gave those draft treaties, those very far-reaching proposals, they still call them, on the security situation in Europe and how it has to change, okay? Now, I suppose it could be a coincidence that the Russians picked that same day, showing a closeness of their relationship with China and giving this ultimatum in some sense to the West and to the US. I don't think it was a coincidence. Maybe we have the next slide, please. Okay, now we fast forward to this year, February 4th, Putin is in Beijing to launch the Olympics with Xi. And he says that, our friendship, well, actually, they both say in a very, very important joint declaration, not just rhetoric, guys. This is the real thing. Friendship between its two states has no limits. There are no, quote, forbidden areas of cooperation. Whoa. Well, are we to take them at their word? When do the Winter Olympics end? When are they over? People were saying that the Russians might strike out against Ukraine, but would pause until the Olympics were over. When did the Russians invade Ukraine? After a couple of days after the end of the Olympics. May we have the next slide, please? Okay, now the big deal here is what a surprise this was to all of us, right? I mean, it wasn't all of us, it was me and lots of others. And I next Saturday, I thought I'd go to confession of being so wrong, but the line was so long with my colleagues that I thought I'd put it off till the next Saturday. Yeah, dead wrong on whether the Russians would invade Ukraine. I didn't think they needed to. I thought they could get what they wanted simply by acquiescing in the notion that they couldn't get NATO to say, no more people in NATO, not going to happen anyway, and then going for what they call the secondary issues, like the employment of cruise missiles and worse, right at the western edge of Russia. But no, it ends up here that China has supported Putin. I think, not only a lot of Russian experts, but a lot of Chinese experts were surprised at that. I mean, rhetoric is one thing. Violating your cardinal foreign policy principle of non-intervention in the affairs of other people, as was China's, is another thing. And it's been a whole week now. We don't know. Maybe the Chinese will change their mind, but so far, and not only China, India. Now, I asked myself the question, well, what's different between the West and the US and India and China? Well, I mean, one obvious difference is they were all white, and they're non-white. And that could be very mischievous because James Baldwin, way back when, suggested that it's much easier for imperialist whites to get out after blacks or browns or yellows. So, does exceeds an alliance mean mutual defense pact? Well, probably not. I don't think the Chinese want to be bound by what happens in Europe. And I don't think the Russians want to be bound by what some crazy Chinaman might do vis-a-vis Taiwan. But it's a virtual alliance. And it's no small thing that China is supporting Putin on the ground at the UN and elsewhere. And it's more than rhetoric. Now, when we talk about Putin's new, I called it assertiveness, and I've been saying for weeks now that China is the much neglected factor behind this. China has made Putin a big guy, like on the streets of New York. Nobody's going to push me around anymore because I got the leader of this other gang that's really, really powerful. So you're going to push me around anymore. I think that's a big part of why Putin has proven not only assertive, but aggressive. And I wonder where he'll stop. I just don't know. The real question here is how we can work to make sure that negotiations succeed once Putin has finished what he intends to do in Ukraine. And that's a biggie. That's really big because right now we're looking pretty silly by imploring the Chinese, look, do something about this fella, do something. Can't you intercede? And we're looking a little bit strange because, as I say, not only China, but other countries, including India, have voted against us. Now, do we have let's see how much time we have. Yeah, for one more minute, I want to show another video. And I think it's important to know this because it's way back a while ago, I think 15, and it shows Putin talking about what really, really troubles him. And it was the notion that tomahawk, as Putin says, missiles can be placed in these so-called ABM sites in Poland, Romania, and maybe even Ukraine. Would it be possible to show the 2.5 minutes of that right now? This is from an old recording. Next clip, which just is about a minute long, and it shows Putin very uncharacteristically losing his cool. He's talking to Western journalists. They don't get it, okay? They have no idea how the Russians look at this as a threat to their national security, as a threat to their retaliatory capability if these missile defense systems are able to squelch their offensive capability with their ICBM. So watch this next thing, and you'll see from this segment, which I hope will go on just a few seconds now, how Putin really is kind of beside himself because, as you can see, some of these Western journalists say, "Oh, that's interesting. Yeah." So let's have that second clip, please. These Western journalists were in St. Petersburg for an economic summit. So there's sort of captive audience. Putin invites them. And the first thing he says to them is, now, I don't expect you to report this factually to your newspapers. And I don't even expect you to tell your superiors about it.
В очередной раз пытались нас надуть. Сейчас построили эту систему. Сейчас ставят там ракеты. Так? Но вам должно быть известно, что ракеты эти закладываются в капсулу, которая используется для пусков ракет средней дальности «Томагавк» морского базирования. Туда закладывают сейчас антиракеты, способные поражать цели на расстоянии 500 километров. Но мы знаем, технологии развиваются. Мы примерно знаем, в каком году примерно американцы получат новую ракету, которая будет уже не 500 километров, а 1000, а потом больше. И с этого момента они начнут угрожать нашему ядерному потенциалу. Мы по годам знаем, что будет происходить. И они знают, что мы знаем. Это вам только вешают лапшу на уши, как у нас говорят. А вы, в свою очередь, вешаете своему населению. И люди не чувствуют опасности. Вот меня что беспокоит. Ну как мы не можем понять? Мы тащим мир вообще в совершенно новое измерение. Вот в чем проблема. Делают вид, что как будто ничего не происходит. Но я не знаю даже, как достучаться.
So there you have it. What's the matter with you folks? Why can't you understand this? And he's talking to the journalists, of course, and you can't see any rational discussion of this in Western media. So just to finish up here, here's Putin way back then saying, how am I going to get through to you? And it was the same in his official conversations with US statesmen, okay? And that's when he and the military in Russia built up these hypersonic missiles. And he said, look, now you have to listen to me. And that's when he went after China to become a virtual ally. Now, I thought, as I wrote, that Putin making these far-reaching proposals would be satisfied with half a loaf. This loaf seemed really important to him. The notion that tomahawks and worse could be stationed right across the border. But no, he wasn't satisfied, obviously. What he wanted to do, and this I underestimated, was to make sure that he protected Russian-speaking and Russian citizens in Ukraine. And he's done that and still more. So where will he stop? I think he stops when he's satisfied that there are no more Nazis or proto-Nazis or neo-Nazis in power there. That's going to take some cleansing, but he's going to do it. And then I hope, and I expect that the Chinese and the Russians get together. Okay, that's enough of that stuff. Now let's get together and make sure nothing untoward happens in the future. I'll yield the floor then. Thanks for listening.
I think that in international politics, states usually pay attention to international law and they pay attention to moral precepts as long as they're in their strategic interests. But if there's a conflict between international law and a country's strategic interests, the country will always privilege its strategic interests, and international law and human rights will be pushed off the table. This is why I think it's not very helpful to talk about rights. When you talk about whether Russia has the right to have a buffer state, or Ukraine has the right to have its own foreign policy, these are concepts that, in my opinion, get you into all sorts of trouble. In the international system, might makes right. And the United States would never tolerate a situation where Canada or Mexico invited, in a legal way, China to bring military forces into Toronto or Mexico City. We have a Monroe Doctrine, which is in our strategic interest. And our Monroe Doctrine says no distant great power is allowed to put military forces in the Western Hemisphere, period. End of story. What the Russians are doing here is they're basically articulating their own version of the Monroe Doctrine. They're saying you cannot turn Ukraine into a Western bastion on our border. It has nothing to do with rights, right? It doesn't matter whether Ukraine has the right to do this or that. We're saying they can't do it. Just like we're saying Cuba can't invite the Soviets to bring military forces into the Western Hemisphere. So for me, when you talk about great power politics, rights in the final analysis just don't matter. Might makes right. And the United States is a mighty powerful country. It's a mighty powerful country on purpose, and it does whatever it thinks is in its strategic interest. And if the rights say that's okay to do, good. But if the rights are at odds with what's in our strategic interest, we do what's in our strategic interest. The Declaration of Independence is of enormous importance. I thank my lucky stars I was born in a liberal democracy, right? And I think, like you, regret the fact that liberal democracy is under threat at home. But my view, and I'm probably different than you, Bruce, in this regard, is that international politics is a different domain than domestic politics. And in international politics, the Thucydides way of thinking about the world, where might makes right, is what applies. I'm not in favor of going around and beating up on other states, and I'm not in favor of wanton violence and so forth and so on. And I do think that what is happening in Ukraine is absolutely horrible. It makes me sick to my stomach. But on the other hand, I think it's very important to understand basic realist logic. And the reason it's important to understand realist logic is because, at least in this case, that's what informs Putin. Putin is thinking like Thucydides. And Americans have a terribly difficult time putting themselves in Putin's shoes. And this is because Americans tend to think in terms of rights and in terms of American exceptionalism and all these other ideas that I think get us into trouble. I think, going back to the film clip that Ray put up there, where Putin talked about in that New York Times op-ed, the trouble America causes by thinking of itself as an exceptional nation, is correct. I just don't want to think that way in IR, and I don't want to think about rights when it comes to international relations.
I just wanted to add, Bruce, that John Mearsheimer needs no endorsement from me, but I would simply add that this is, I think, we talk about offensive realism or offensive. It's offensive to think that one should have to deal not so much with rights, but with might when one is judging international relations problems. But realism really needs to be the primary factor here, particularly when, as John pointed out at the beginning of his remarks, it matters greatly as to how we got here and who bears the primary responsibility.
I think that the question that is really on the table here is whether or not, with sanctions and the costs of war, just the cost of losing people and fighting in Ukraine, that coupled with economic sanctions can inflict enough punishment on the Russian people and the oligarchs that they rise up against Putin, right? This is the question. And I think there are two reasons that's not going to happen. I'm not saying I'm right, you're wrong, but I think that what the scenario that you two described will not prove to be correct. And let me tell you why. The first is nationalism. States are able to sustain huge amounts of punishment, and the population does not rise up against the ruler. You want to think about what we did to Japan in World War II. You want to think about what we did to Germany. You want to think about the literature on sanctions, economic sanctions. Look at Iran. It's amazing what we've done to Iran. Look at Cuba. There have been sanctions on Cuba forever, right? And these countries don't throw up their hands. So the first point I would make to you is nationalism is a very powerful force. And I think that the Russian people will rally around Putin. Second point I would make to you is, as a result of this this talk that I gave that's ricocheting all over the internet, plus the New Yorker piece, I get like 1,000 emails every day. I can't even open up all the emails I get. But I've gotten a number of emails from Russians. These are educated people who are not hostile to me in any way. And I read those emails to say that you want to understand that you Americans are threatening Mother Russia. And what's going on here is not simply a case of Putin misbehaving and us liking the Americans. And what's going to happen here is we're going to overthrow Putin. The emails I'm getting, and this is not a scientific sample, but it is consistent with my general point about nationalism, is that the more we push against the Russians in Ukraine and the more we threaten the regime, the more that people will rally around Putin. Now, again, I could be proved wrong on that, but my bet is that he'll be able to withstand the sanctions. And by the way, this gets to Ray's point. Ray's point is the Chinese are going to help him. We know the Indians are going to help him. We've heard that the Mexicans are going to help him. So it's not clear that we'll be able to punish him that much over the long term. But then again, even if we do punish him, do you think that's going to bring the Russian people to their knees or Putin to his knees? I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that.
Well, I would like to identify myself with what John just said. But let's posit, in other words, I think the Russians will get through this. I think there are a lot of reasons that they will. Let's posit that Putin does have his back up against the wall. I think it was Jack Matlock, my friend Jack, who suggested he's not quite sure of Putin's relative stability now. It's a legitimate question. I was surprised as hell that he invaded Ukraine, even with Chinese support, even under threat of all kinds of other things, sanctions. But he did. And he sounds a little bit more emotional than I've ever heard him sound before. So will it be a good thing if Putin's back is up against the wall? I don't think so. And this is why. He gratuitously, for the first time in my experience, that goes back about 60 years, raised the nuclear possibility. That is big, okay? That means that he would consider employing that if he really had his back against the wall. Now, what does he look at? What does he see when he looks at the United States? He sees what Ted Postol has just explained to us. He sees that he doesn't have global dominance, so the global awareness to find out what's being shot at him and when. He also sees people like Admiral Thomas Richards, head of SAC, now called Stratfor, who says, we might have to use nuclear weapons. He says he sees people like, what's his name, that little guy, Stavridis. Yeah, he says Stavridis, another admiral. Yeah, we're going to be in a nuclear war with China in 10 years. That's what Putin sees. And so the reason this thing is so labil, as the Germans would put it, so tentative and so dangerous, is because these people need to keep their mouths shut. And what Putin would like is to Biden shut these guys up and say, look, no one wins in a nuclear war. I signed that thing with Putin. He agrees. So we're not even going to talk about that. And yet here we have Putin talking about it. So it's a matter of Putin's stability and what having his back up against the wall. I don't think it's going to happen because of the sanctions. What that would mean, that would not be good news in my view.